When I told my son Derek that I was going to marry a woman I'd met online, a woman from the Philippines who I'd never been in the same room with, he set down his coffee mug so slowly and carefully that I could tell he was trying to decide how to say what he was thinking without starting a fight. He didn't succeed. "Dad," he said, "come on." That was in the autumn, a little over 3 years ago. I was 64 years old. 31 years with the city of Calgary behind me, retired, with a pension and a house in Varsity that felt twice as large as it needed to be. My wife Ellen had been gone 5 years by then. The kids were settled. The grandchildren were growing up faster than any of us expected. And my days had taken on the kind of quiet that sounds peaceful when you describe it to someone else, but feels different when you're living inside it. Derek wasn't the only one who had something to say. My daughter Tess was gentler about it. She's always been the one who thinks before she speaks, which she did not get from me, but her concern came through clearly enough. She hugged me and said she just wanted me to be happy, which was true. She also asked, very carefully, whether I'd been talking to anyone. She meant a grief counselor. She was worried I'd confused loneliness with love, and I understood that. I'd wondered the same thing myself. My friend Pete, who I've known since we were both young men working the same construction projects in the 90s, listened to the whole story without interrupting me once. That's almost unheard of for Pete. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You sure about this one, bud?" The honest answer was no. I wasn't sure at all. Most people telling this kind of story years later don't admit that part. They smooth it out, make it sound like they always knew. I didn't always know. There were nights I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold and thought seriously about the idea that maybe everyone who was worried about me had a point. But I need to tell you how this started, because if I skip to the part where everyone found out, you'll miss the part that actually mattered. About a year and a half before any of that, I had joined a travel photography group on Facebook. Not because I was especially good at photography, I wasn't, but because I'd started taking my camera on walks and it gave me something to do with my hands. Someone in the group commented on a photo I'd posted of the Bow River in November, the ice just starting to form at the edges, the light going pale and orange across the water. She said it looked like something out of a painting. I thanked her. She had posted a photo of her own from somewhere I didn't recognize, a harbor at dusk, warm light, fishing boats sitting low in the water. I asked where it was taken. "Lahug," she said, "the Philippines." We traded a few more comments over the following days. Then she sent a direct message asking whether I'd ever been to Southeast Asia because she'd always been curious about Canada. I said no, never been, and asked her what Cebu was like. She sent back a long reply about the food, the traffic, the way the harbor looked in the morning, the rainy season. Then she apologized for writing too much. I told her she hadn't written nearly enough. Her name was Celia. She was in her mid-40s, worked as a coordinator at a small medical clinic in Lahug, and had lived in Cebu her whole life except for 2 years in Manila when she was young that she didn't seem to remember fondly. She spoke about her city the way someone does when they genuinely like it. She'd tell me about Carbon Market on a Saturday morning, about the tricycle drivers who always had the radio too loud, about the cat that had claimed the front step of her apartment building as its personal domain. I told her about Calgary the same way. The Chinook winds that could flip the temperature 20 degrees in a single afternoon. The line at Tim Hortons that moved either impossibly fast or not at all, never anything in between. How I'd spent 31 years watching this city grow into something enormous, and somehow still felt like the same person I'd been when I arrived. Weeks went by, then months. I'm not sure either of us could have said exactly when the conversation stopped being casual and became something we looked forward to every day. It wasn't one moment. It was gradual, the way mornings after a long winter start to feel different without you being able to point to the exact day the light changed. What I noticed, and hadn't expected, was that I wasn't performing around her. Since Ellen died, there had always been this quiet pressure with most people to seem fine, to be the version of myself that had it together. With Celia, the conversation just went wherever it went. If I'd had a frustrating day, I said so. If something made me laugh on a walk and I told her about it, and it didn't land the way I'd hoped, we moved on without it being awkward. There was no audience, no one to impress. One evening she laughed so hard at something I'd said about a seagull stealing a granola bar from a cyclist on the Elbow River path that she had to put the camera down and collect herself before she could respond. I sat there laughing too, mostly because her laugh was the kind that made you feel like you'd accomplished something just by hearing it. When she finally came back on screen, eyes a little watery, she shook her head and said, "You have no idea how good that felt." That was the first time I realized something had changed, and it took me another 3 months to admit to myself what it was. There was one thing I hadn't told her about. One conversation with Derek that very nearly ended the whole thing before it had the chance to go anywhere. I'll get back to it, because it matters more than most of what I'm about to tell you, but you need to understand where we were first. By the time I finally decided to buy a plane ticket to Cebu, we had been talking for almost a year. The question of meeting in person had come up in the way things come up when neither person is quite ready to say them out loud, briefly, carefully, with a quick change of subject afterward. Then one evening, Celia said something I hadn't expected. "I hope we get to meet someday," she said. "But if it doesn't work out that way, I want you to know I've really valued this." She wasn't pushing. She wasn't hinting. She was simply acknowledging that things don't always work out, and she had made her peace with that. I sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. What struck me was that she wasn't asking me to come. She was already grateful for what we had, and somehow that made it easier to start looking at flights. The harder part was telling Derek and Tess. I mentioned it the way you'd mention any trip. Thought I'd head overseas for a few weeks, see a different part of the world. Tess asked where. I said the Philippines. She said that sounded interesting and asked if it was safe, the way Canadians ask about everywhere that isn't Canada. Then she asked who I knew there. That's when I told her. Derek found out 2 days later. He called that evening, and the tone told me he and Tess had already talked. He asked how long this had been going on. "A year," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then the questions started. Had we ever met in person? Had she asked for money? Did she have family expecting me to support them? Did I know how common this kind of thing was? I let him finish. Then I said I hadn't sent anyone money, nobody had asked, and I'd been talking to this woman almost every single day for a year. He said, "Dad, there are people who do this for a living. You're not the first." I knew that. I'd read the same things he had. But what I couldn't explain, not yet, because I was still working it out myself, was that nothing she'd ever done had matched any of those patterns. She had never asked. She had never pushed. She had never made me feel like there was a transaction involved. Over the next week, Derek sent me an article, then another. Then a link to a forum where men shared stories about being deceived by women from Southeast Asia. By the time I finished reading, I'll be honest with you, I had questions I hadn't had before. But that's still not the conversation that almost made me cancel. That came later. Derek called again one evening and said something he hadn't said the first time around. He said, "Dad, Mom's been gone 5 years. You're allowed to be lonely. But I don't want you making a decision this big because you're lonely." I told him I was fine. He said, "I know you think you are." I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I thought Derek was right about Celia, but because the word lonely had landed somewhere it doesn't shake off easily. I lay there and thought about the silence in that house, the way a Tuesday in November felt like all the other Tuesdays, the way I'd gotten good at not noticing. And I wondered, the way you do sometimes in the middle of the night when no one can hear your thoughts, whether my son was seeing something I wasn't. For a few days, I thought seriously about canceling. Then I told Celia about it. Not about canceling. About all of it. The articles Derek sent, the forum posts, the things my family had been saying, and the part about loneliness, which was the hardest thing to put into words because I wasn't sure I disagreed with it entirely. I kept my voice as steady as I could, but by the time I finished, the quiet on her end of the call felt like it had weight. She was still for a moment. Then she said, "I understand why they're worried. If my own father had started talking to a woman from Canada he'd never met, I'd probably feel the same way." I hadn't expected that. She said, "I can't tell your family what to think of me. Only time can do that. But I'm not asking you to choose between them and me. I'm just asking you to know me a little longer before you decide." Not defensive, not just honest. I've thought about that moment many times since. What struck me most was what she didn't do. She didn't accuse me of doubting her. She didn't tell me Derek was wrong. She understood the fear, and she was patient with it. That, more than anything, was what made me stop listening to the noise and start paying attention to what was actually in front of me. I bought the ticket 3 days later. Flying into Mactan Cebu International, the heat hits you the moment the doors open. After a Calgary winter, it's the kind of warmth that doesn't feel real right away. I stood on the walkway just taking it in, this thick tropical air that smelled like jet fuel and something floral underneath it, and thought, well, you've done it now. She was waiting in the arrivals area. She had made a small handmade sign with my name on it, and beside it a tiny maple leaf she'd drawn in red marker. I laughed when I saw it. She smiled and said, "You're taller than your photos." I said, "You drew a maple leaf." She said, "I thought you might need to feel at home." That's Celia. What surprised me most during those first days wasn't that she was exactly who she'd seemed to be. It was how quickly ordinary felt ordinary. We walked through the Lahug neighborhood in the early morning when it was still bearable, had breakfast at a small place on Salinas Drive where the ceiling fan worked harder than the air conditioning. We went to Carbon Market on a Saturday morning, and she moved through the stalls the way you move through somewhere you've known your whole life, stopping to talk to vendors by name, choosing mangoes by feel. At one point, an elderly woman selling dried fish knocked over her display basket. Before I had registered what happened, Celia was there, picking things up, helping her reorganize, buying something from her, and refusing to take the change. She came back and continued the conversation we'd been having as though nothing had happened. She never brought it up afterward. I don't think she even knew I'd been watching. But I noticed, because you can't rehearse that. Coming home to Calgary was harder than I'd expected. The house felt same, the cold felt the same. Pete picked me up from the airport and asked how it went, and I said it went well, and he looked at me and nodded slowly the way Pete does when he's deciding whether to say the thing he's thinking. He said it, "So what's the plan?" I told him I wasn't sure that her moving to Calgary was the right question anymore. That stopped him. "You thinking of going there?" I said I was starting to. The practical work took months. My Alberta health coverage wouldn't follow me to Southeast Asia. That's just how provincial insurance works when you stop being a resident. I found a private international health plan that covered me properly, worked out what the CPP would look like deposited monthly from overseas, had the house in Varsity listed in the spring. Selling it was both harder and easier than I expected. Derek and Tess thought I had lost my mind completely. Derek, to his credit, argued with me directly instead of going quiet about it. He came over one Sunday and we sat in the kitchen for 3 hours going through every concern he had. The health care, the money, what happened if things went wrong, whether I'd be able to get home easily if I needed to. I answered every question as honestly as I could. He didn't agree with me at the end of it, but he said he knew he couldn't stop me, and he asked me to promise I'd call every week. I promised. 6 months after I moved to Cebu. We were living on a quiet street in Lahug by then, neighbors who had brought over food when we first arrived, a corner store where the owner knew what I'd order. Before I got through the door, I got sick. It started as a bad headache and a fever I couldn't shake. By the second day, I was in a hospital bed at Chonghua Hospital in Cebu City, diagnosed with dengue. If you've never had it, the short version is that it makes you feel like your bones are made of something that doesn't belong inside a body. For about 4 days, I wasn't fully sure where I was half the time. Celia was there the entire time. Not hovering, not dramatic, just present. She spoke with the doctors in Cebuano and then translated everything back to me in plain English. She filed my insurance paperwork when I couldn't sit up without the room spinning. She slept in the chair beside my bed, which cannot have been comfortable, and she never once mentioned that it wasn't. On the third night, I told her she should go home and sleep. She said, "I'll go when you're better." I said, "You don't have to stay." She looked at me with the calm expression of someone who has already made a decision and doesn't need to discuss it further. She said, "Yes, I do." That was the moment, not the airport, not the morning in Carbon Market, not her laughing on the video call years before. That was when I understood something fully. This woman wasn't here because of what I had. She was here because of who I was to her. I was out of hospital in 5 days. Celia brought me home and made a soup I still think about, and the neighbor across the street, a retired fisherman whose name I still pronounce badly, came over with mangoes and sat with us on the porch for a while. And it occurred to me that I was surrounded by people who felt like neighbors, actually felt like it, and somewhere along the way that had become my life. Derek came to visit the following year. He stayed 10 days. By the third morning, Celia had figured out that my son liked his coffee strong and his mornings quiet, and she gave him both without making a production of it. He helped her carry some boxes she was moving between rooms without being asked. By the end of the trip, something had shifted in him. The morning he left for the airport, he said to me, "She made me breakfast every morning." I said, "I know, that's just what she does." He nodded, picked up his bag, then he said, "I get it now, Dad." He wasn't apologizing. He was just telling me he'd understood something he hadn't understood before. That meant more to me than any apology would have. People still ask me sometimes whether I think I made the right decision. Usually someone who's curious about living overseas, or someone nervous about a big change of their own. They want a clean answer, and the truth is, I can't give them one, because the truth isn't clean. I left behind a house I'd lived in for 20 years. I left behind Pete, who I still call every Sunday, and the grandchildren, who I video call on Thursday evenings, and the Bow River in November when the ice is just coming in at the edges. I miss those things. Missing them doesn't mean I made the wrong choice. What I know is this: every person who worried about me was doing it because they cared. Derek sent those articles because he loved me and didn't want to watch me get hurt. Tess asked careful questions because losing her mother had already taught her how fast things can change. Pete said, "You sure about this one? Because that's what a good friend does." None of them were wrong to ask. They were wrong to answer the question before they'd met her. If someone told me today that a person they cared about was doing something similar, meeting someone from across the world, thinking about starting over past 60, building something new out of what looked from the outside like a risk, I'd tell them to go slowly, pay attention, watch how someone treats other people when nothing is being asked of them. I'd tell them to notice whether the person talks about the future with hope or with urgency, whether they ask questions or just answer them, whether they show up when showing up is inconvenient. And then I'd tell them to make their own call. Not based on articles, not based on statistics, not based on stories that ended badly for someone else, based on what they actually see over enough time to trust what they're seeing. I look across the room tonight and Celia is at the kitchen table going through clinic paperwork, pushing her glasses up with one finger the way she always does, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. The cat that has claimed the front step of this building as its own. A different cat from the one she told me about years ago. But just as certain the territory is his, is somewhere outside, probably asleep. Everyone who told me I'd regret this has had the chance to meet her now. I haven't heard anyone say it since.